Amira grew up in the grand home of the Bukuli family in Luanda, but not as one of them. Her mother was the househelp, and Amira was just the quiet girl in the background, the one no one really noticed, except when she was needed. She learned early how to move silently, how to make herself small. But deep inside, she carried big dreams. She loved sketching dresses in the corners of old notebooks, even if no one believed in her. One day her friend, the Bukuli's daughter, invited her to a dinner party. Amira wore the best dress she had stitched by hand, nervous but excited. For the first time, she felt like maybe she belonged. But when she tried to sit at the table with the other guests, a woman looked at her with disgust and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That seat isn't for people like you." Laughter followed. Amira froze. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, her heart sinking. She smiled to hide the sting, but something inside her broke. Or maybe, something inside her woke up. That night, Amira realized one thing. If they wouldn't give her a seat, she would one day build her own table. It was a sunny Saturday in Luanda, and Amira had been invited to a charity brunch, the kind of event where people wore pearls, sipped sparkling juice, and took photos for magazines. The event was hosted by the powerful Madame Yavin, a woman known across the city for her wealth, connections, and sharp tongue. Amira had stitched gowns for half the women at the event, including Madame Yavin herself, but still she walked in quietly, dressed in one of her own creations, simple, elegant, handmade. She wasn't there to show off. She just wanted to support the cause and maybe learn something from the powerful women in the room. When she spotted her mentor, an older designer who once encouraged her during a market show, Amira felt a little braver. She walked over and gently reached for an empty chair next to her. That's when it happened. Before she could even sit, a tall woman with gold bangles and a loud voice sneered and said, "Excuse me, that chair is for investors, not tailors." The words cut through the room like a knife. Someone giggled. Another woman covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. The rest just looked away awkwardly, pretending not to notice. Amira stood frozen, her hands still on the chair. Her cheeks burned. Her heart felt like it would burst out of her chest. But she smiled, a small, tight smile, and quietly stepped back. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She found another chair far at the back near the servers. And she sat there like nothing had happened. But inside something shifted. Not just pain, something deeper. A fire. That moment, that humiliation in front of people she had served and admired, planted a seed in her heart. It told her, this world won't make space for you, so you'll have to create your own. And as she looked around that fancy room full of power and pride, Amira made a quiet promise to herself. One day they'd remember the tailor they laughed at. One day they'd wish they had saved her a seat. Amira had stitched gowns and suits for so many of the women and men at that charity party. Her hands had shaped their elegance. Her threads had held their confidence together. They wore her designs proudly, smiling for cameras, posing for social media. But not a single one of them looked her in the eye that day. No one said, "Thank you." No one even seemed to remember who she was. "She's just a seamstress," one woman whispered when Amira walked by. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. They sank deep into her chest. Another guest gave her a pitying glance, like she didn't belong in a place like that. Amira kept her head up, but inside her heart was slowly breaking. Later that night, long after the lights had gone out and the music had faded, Amira sat alone in her tiny room in Kibogo. Her sewing machine stood quietly in the corner, covered in bits of thread and fabric scraps. Her fingers were sore, bandaged from pricks and burns. She had worked nonstop for weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating, to meet the orders for that very party. But now it felt like none of it mattered. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had made magic with cloth, and suddenly they felt invisible. Was this all she was? Just a nameless tailor behind the scenes? Tears welled up, but she wiped them away quickly. She'd cried enough. Instead, she reached for a roll of soft kitenge fabric she had been saving, a piece no one else had wanted because it was too dull. But Amira saw something else in it. She ran her fingers over it gently, whispering to herself, "They may not see me now, but one day they will wear my name." And in that quiet, painful night, with bruised hands and a bruised heart, she began to sketch again. Because no matter how many people ignored her, Amira knew the fabric they mocked was the very thing that would one day carry her to greatness. Amira lived in a tiny one-room flat in Kabogo. The walls were cracked, the window hardly closed, and the sewing machine took up half the space. Her mattress lay on the floor beside piles of fabric. Most nights, she went to sleep with the sound of rats in the roof, and the hum of her sewing machine still ringing in her ears. But this night felt different. There was a heaviness in her chest. Not just sadness, but a deep burning ache that wouldn't let her rest. She sat on the floor and reached under her sewing table. Hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers was a folded paper, a sketch she had drawn in secret months ago. She opened it gently, smoothing out the creases. It was a drawing of a mansion. Not just any mansion, but her dream home. Tall windows, a grand staircase, a studio for girls who wanted to learn fashion. A house full of light, laughter, and purpose. Amira stared at the sketch, tears brimming in her eyes. She had no money, no name, no family connections. Just the bruises on her hands from years of sewing, and the scars on her heart from being told she'd never be more than just a tailor. But this sketch, this dream, kept whispering to her. Keep going. Don't stop now. I don't have what they have, she whispered to the empty room. But I have this. She pointed to her heart. I have the hunger, the rage, and I have God. It wasn't a loud declaration. It was quiet, almost like a prayer. But it changed something inside her. That night, she pinned the sketch to her wall. Not to impress anyone, not even to show off, but to remind herself that even if no one believed in her, she still did. And God wasn't finished with her yet. That one sketch, drawn in secret with nothing but hope and pain, would become the seed that changed everything. Because sometimes all it takes is one dream, one broken heart, and one unstoppable woman. After that night with the sketch on the wall, Amira changed. She no longer waited for people to see her. She got up every morning with fire in her heart and thread in her hands. She began working non-stop, stitching from sunrise to long past midnight. Her sewing machine became her best friend, the hum of it filling the room like music. Weddings, funerals, school uniforms, birthday gowns. She took every job that came her way. Some paid her fairly. Most didn't. But she said yes anyway. She stitched through back pain, through swollen fingers, through hunger. She worked even when her eyes were red from crying. She stitched when the power went out, using a tiny solar lamp to light her hands. Her needles broke. Her fabric tore. Her fingers bled. But Amira kept going. Whenever she felt like giving up, she'd look at the sketch on her wall, the dream mansion, and whisper to herself, "Don't worry. One day they'll ask to sit at my table." That small whisper gave her strength. That one line became her prayer, her fuel. Sometimes customers mocked her prices. "Why should we pay more? You're just in Kibogo," they'd say. Still, she smiled and delivered her best work. She wasn't just sewing clothes. She was building her future, one stitch at a time. Every order, no matter how small, was another brick in her dream. There were nights she didn't sleep at all. Nights when she worked straight through till morning, with only a cup of tea to keep her going. Her mother would call and beg her to rest. But Amira would laugh gently and say, "Mama, rest can wait. I'm building something." She didn't have investors. She didn't have rich friends. But she had determination, pain, and a clear vision. And deep inside, she knew something they didn't. Greatness doesn't always start with applause. Sometimes, it starts in silence, with a broken needle and a girl who refuses to give up. It happened on a night Amira almost didn't care about. A national award show was trending online, and she had been too busy with orders to even notice. But one of her clients, a small-time influencer named Laura, had begged Amira to make her a dress. "I can't pay much," Laura had admitted, "but I promise to tag you." Amira had smiled. She was used to that line. But something in Laura's voice felt honest, desperate, even, and Amira understood that kind of hunger. So she said yes. Amira poured her heart into that dress. It was gold and emerald, made from leftover fabric she'd kept for someday. She stitched it with care, adding hand-sewn beads and a flowing train. When she handed it to Laura, she said softly, "You may not feel like a star, but wear this like one." That night, Amira sat in her little room, working as always. Then her phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. And again. Within minutes, her notifications were exploding. "Who made Laura's dress?" people were asking. "That gown is stunning." It was all over Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Laura's picture standing on the red carpet, glowing in Amira's creation. One fashion blogger posted, "That's not just a dress. That's a statement." Amira stared at her phone, tears filling her eyes. Her hands, the same ones that had been ignored, bruised, and burned, had just dressed a woman in something the whole country couldn't stop talking about. The credits under the photo read, Amira Designs, Kabogo Tailoring Hut. From that moment, her phone didn't stop ringing. Orders came in from cities she'd never even visited. Clients wanted to know, "Are you the one who made that dress?" Yes, she was. The same girl they once called just a tailor. The same girl who was told she didn't belong. Her little tailoring hut in Kabogo, with its broken floor tiles and plastic chairs, had just birthed a national fashion name. And Amira? She sat quietly whispering to herself, "I told you. One day they'd want a seat at my table." It felt like a dream when the email came in. A top fashion brand from Cape Town had seen Amira's viral dress and wanted her to showcase her designs at their international fashion event. Her hands trembled as she read it over and over again. Finally, her work was being seen. Finally, she was being invited to the table. She used almost all her savings to prepare. She worked day and night, creating 3 original designs. Each one told a story of struggle, beauty, and rising above shame. She even borrowed money to buy her first suitcase. When she boarded the bus to Cape Town, she carried more than clothes. She carried hope. But when she arrived at the glamorous hotel venue, dressed in one of her handmade gowns, everything changed. At the entrance, she introduced herself, proudly showing her invitation. But the woman at the front desk barely looked up before saying, "Oh, vendors use the back door." Amira blinked. "Sorry, I'm not a vendor. I was invited to showcase." The woman frowned. "Designers with runway slots are already inside. Please go round back." Confused and humiliated, Amira stepped aside. She watched as other designers, dressed in name brands with teams and makeup artists, were welcomed in with smiles and champagne. She stood there alone, holding her suitcase, heart pounding. A security guard finally pointed her to a small back entrance, near the dumpsters. There, someone told her she could maybe leave her clothes for the showroom floor, but she wasn't allowed on the main stage. "You're not on the walk list." "Sorry, madam." Amira stood outside in silence, the wind brushing her face. Her heart ached, not just from the rejection, but from the reminder. Even with all her hard work, some still didn't see her. But instead of breaking, something inside her hardened like steel. She looked up at the grand building and whispered, "One day I won't need your runway. I'll build my own stage." Then she turned around, suitcase in hand, and walked out. When Amira got back to Kabogo after the Cape Town heartbreak, she didn't collapse. She didn't complain. She quietly unpacked her suitcase, placed her dresses on the table, and sat for a long time just staring at them. These weren't just outfits, they were pieces of her soul. She remembered every needle prick, every late night, every tear she stitched into those seams. And suddenly an idea came to her, not just for a collection but for a message. She named it Forgotten Daughters. It was more than fashion. It was a tribute to women like her, the ones who were overlooked, rejected, underestimated. Women who were told they didn't belong at the table. The ones who worked in silence, gave everything but were never seen. Amira began designing with purpose. She used bold, beautiful African fabrics and gave each piece a name. The maid's crown, the girl at the gate, the widow's light. Every dress carried a story. She posted pictures online using her small Instagram page and wrote, "For every woman who's ever been told she's not enough, this is for you." She didn't expect much. But within days, the response exploded. Messages poured in from across Africa. Women sent voice notes crying. Others shared their own stories of being ignored, laughed at, or pushed aside. "Your clothes speak for us," one woman wrote. "You gave our pain a voice." Orders came flooding in. Amira's tiny flat turned into a workshop. Local girls came to help her. Some didn't even know how to sew. They just wanted to be part of something that finally made them feel seen. What started as a broken heart became a movement. Amira no longer sewed just to survive. She sewed to heal, to honor, to uplift. She had no fancy shop or sponsors, just thread, pain, and faith. But that was enough, because when a woman turns pain into power, the whole world begins to listen. Amira had never stepped into a bank like that before. One with marble floors, glass doors, and men in suits who barely looked her way. But on that day, she walked in wearing a chitinge suit she had stitched herself. It wasn't just stylish, it was bold, bright orange and deep blue, with patterns that told her story before she even spoke. Her hands were shaking, but her back was straight. She was tired of being small. She had built something real, and now she was ready to take the next step. She had come to ask for a loan, her first big one. Enough to move her workshop out of her small flat and into something bigger. Something she could grow in. Something that made space for the other forgotten daughters she was now training. At first, the loan officer gave her that look, the one she knew too well. The look that said, "You're not supposed to be here." But then Amira laid out her plans. Her books. Her orders. Her designs. Her photos. She spoke from the heart, telling the man how her small tailoring hut had gone viral, how her clothes were now being worn in 5 countries, how she had a waitlist that stretched for months. Something changed in his eyes. An hour later, Amira stepped out of that bank with the papers in her hand. Approved. She had done it. And that wasn't all. She had already found the place she wanted, an old colonial mansion in Luanda. Faded walls, cracked floors, overgrown yard. But when Amira looked at it, she didn't see ruin. She saw home. She saw fashion shows, classrooms, a showroom, a space where girls like her could dream louder. The same neighborhood where she was once told she didn't belong. She now held the keys. Amira stood at the gate of the mansion, holding the iron keys in her hand, tears in her eyes. And she whispered, "God, they said no for so long. But today someone finally said yes." The mansion was old, dusty, and falling apart. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked, and weeds had taken over the garden. Most people saw it as a waste of money. But not Amira. When she stood in front of it, all she could see was potential. She didn't hire a fancy architect. Instead, she pulled out her old sketchbook, the same one she used back in her tiny flat in Kibogo, and began drawing her dream again. This time it was real. Room by room she redesigned everything. The front hall would be the showroom, filled with her latest designs. The back would become a training school for girls. Girls like her with big dreams but no support. Upstairs she planned an office, a sewing studio, and a space for healing. A quiet room with soft pillows, journals, and music where the girls could breathe and feel safe. Took months. She worked with local carpenters, painters, and welders, many of whom had daughters they brought along to help. Every wall she repainted, every tile she replaced. She thought about the girls who would walk those halls one day. She remembered every time she was laughed at, pushed aside, or told to use the back door. Not this time. This time she was building a place where every door would be wide open. On the day of the launch, the mansion looked like a dream. White walls, bright flowers, soft lights, and handmade art. At the center was a long table, shining under the sun. And at the head of that table, Amira had placed golden chairs. Not for celebrities, not for politicians, but for the girls who were once told they didn't belong. Each chair had a name on it: Zawadi, Nia, Promise, Aching, Fatu. Forgotten daughters now remembered. As the guests arrived, many wiped tears from their eyes. And Amira stood quietly near the door, her heart full. She didn't just renovate a building. She rebuilt a story. She turned shame into beauty, and silence into legacy. This was no longer just a mansion. It was a home built by love, pain, and purr. The invitations arrived in cream-colored envelopes, thick and elegant, with gold embroidery on the edges. Each one had a name carefully stitched into the fabric. Not printed, stitched. They were hard to ignore, especially when they came from someone the elite thought they'd never hear from again. Amira House, from seamstress to owner. That was the title printed on every invite. A private fashion gala. Exclusive. Formal. Strictly by name. The location? The newly restored colonial mansion in Luanda. The same neighborhood where years ago, Amira had been told she didn't belong. When Madame Yavin opened hers, she nearly dropped it. The same girl whose chair she had once removed at a charity brunch, now hosting a gala? A few of her friends snickered. "Who does she think she is?" one said. "It's probably just a small-town show," another laughed. But curiosity has a way of pulling people where pride won't let them stay away. And so, dressed in their finest gowns and heels, the same women who once whispered, "She's just a tailor," arrived at the gates of Amira House. They expected a dusty little event. Maybe a few plastic chairs, some loud music, and cheap wine. But what they saw took their breath away. The mansion glowed under warm lights. A red carpet rolled across the garden path. Soft music played from live African instruments. Uniformed ushers welcomed them inside, offering drinks named after Amira's designs. The air smelled of jasmine, vanilla, and success. And everywhere they looked, elegance, class, power. Their laughter faded. They were used to being the ones celebrated. But tonight, they were guests in a house built by the very girl they once humiliated. Every corner of the event whispered her story. Pain stitched into power, rejection turned into royalty. As they sat down, one of the women leaned over and whispered, "I can't believe this is the same girl from Kibogo." But it was. It was Amira. The grand hall was glowing with gold lights, soft music, and quiet chatter. Guests filled the room, sipping drinks, admiring the fashion displays, pretending not to be shocked by how beautiful everything looked. But there was one thing missing: the host. Everyone was waiting for her. Then the music paused. A soft drumbeat started. The doors at the far end slowly opened. And there she was. Amira walked in alone, wearing a deep red traditional gown that flowed like fire. It shimmered under the lights, but it wasn't the fabric that stole the room. It was the names. All over the dress, stitched by hand in golden thread, were names. Over 300 of them. Names of women no one remembered. Housemaids, street vendors, widows, school dropouts. Every one of them a forgotten daughter. The room went completely silent. Madame Yavin froze, her eyes wide. One woman gasped softly. Another covered her mouth in shock. It wasn't just the beauty of the gown. It was the meaning behind it. Each name represented a woman who had been ignored, pushed aside, told she didn't belong. And now those names were walking boldly into a room that once shut its doors on them. Amira didn't rush. She walked slowly, proudly, her head high, her face calm. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was simply powerful, in a way that couldn't be bought or faked. By the time she reached the front of the hall, the silence had turned into clapping. First a few hands, then more. Then the whole room stood and applauded. The same people who once laughed at her, who turned her away, who told her she wasn't good enough, they were now on their feet. Amira smiled softly. Not out of pride, but out of peace. She wasn't there to prove anything. She didn't need their approval anymore. She was no longer the girl asking for a seat. She had become the woman they all came to see. Amira stepped up to the stage, calm and graceful, her red gown still shimmering under the lights. The same stage where, years ago, she had once been told, that platform is for investors and professionals, not tailors. Back then, she had stood at the back of the room, watching others shine while hiding her pain behind a polite smile. But tonight was different. Tonight, the spotlight was hers. The microphone waited, and the crowd fell silent. All eyes were on her. The same eyes that once looked past her like she didn't exist. Amira took a slow breath, looked around the grand hall, and began to speak. Her voice was soft, but steady. Years ago, I stood in this same room, wearing a dress I had stitched with my own hands. I reached for a seat, and someone pulled the chair away. There was a quiet gasp in the room. They told me the table wasn't for people like me. And I believed it, for a while. She paused, letting the words sink in. But pain is a teacher. Rejection is fuel. And God? God sees everything. Her eyes glistened with emotion, but her voice stayed strong. You didn't let me sit at your table, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. So I built my own house, and set the table for others. The audience was still. Some blinked back tears. Others looked down in quiet shame. The message hit deep, because they knew. They had laughed, ignored, looked away when she needed them most. But tonight, she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for healing. I built this place for every forgotten daughter. For every girl who was told she wasn't good enough. This is our table now. As she stepped away from the podium, the applause came loud and long. Amira didn't bow. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, knowing this was more than a speech. It was a moment of truth. The girl they once denied had not only risen, she had returned with grace, power, and a table big enough for others to rise to. The mansion that once stood in silence now echoed with laughter, questions, and the hum of sewing machines. Amira's dream had become a living, breathing place, not just for her but for others. Her fashion school now welcomed 80 girls from all over the country. Most of them came from rural villages, small towns, or places no one talked about. Some had never seen a city before. Some had never been told they were capable of more. But now they sat at polished mahogany tables, surrounded by bright fabrics, color pencils, mannequins, and notebooks full of dreams. They weren't just learning how to sew, they were learning how to build. They studied fashion design, yes, but also business, storytelling, branding, and self-confidence. They were taught how to speak up, how to price their work, how to walk with pride. Amira walked through the rooms quietly, smiling as she passed. A girl from Kalonzo village was sketching her first collection. Another from Bwera had just completed her first client order. One shy girl who used to barely speak now stood in front of the class, teaching others how to thread a needle. This was why Amira had kept going when everything told her to quit. Some mornings she arrived early and just watched them from the hallway. Braids bouncing, laughter rising, small hands cutting fabric with care. It reminded her of herself, the girl who once stitched dresses alone in the dark, whispering promises to her broken heart. Now the promises were real. She didn't need to be in every photo or take credit for every success. Just knowing she had made space for these girls was enough. A space where they felt seen, heard, and powerful. Amira didn't just build a fashion school. She built a safe place, a launch pad, a home. Because she knew when you give a girl a chair, she might sit. But when you give her a table, she builds an empire. Months after her grand gala and the roaring success of her fashion school, Amira received an email with a shiny logo at the top. It was from one of the same elite fashion houses that once turned her away, the same people who told her to use the back door, who laughed when she showed up in Kabogo fabric, and who once said the runway wasn't for vendors. Now they wanted to partner. They called her brand bold, relevant, and globally inspiring. They offered resources, international exposure, and a chance to collaborate for mutual growth. Amira read the email slowly with a small smile on her face, not out of pride but because life really does turn full circle. She remembered standing outside their Cape Town event, watching the lights, trying to smile through rejection. And now here they were knocking on her door. She took a breath and typed her reply. "Thank you for your kind offer. Unfortunately, my table is already full, with those who believed before the applause. But you're always welcome to attend the next class on humility. Sincerely, Amira." She sent it, gently closed her laptop, and looked out the window where her students were hanging up colorful fabrics under the sun. Amira didn't need to chase validation anymore. She had planted her own garden, built her own house, and filled her own table, with women who once had none. That was more than enough.